Hello, you're watching Outsiders. Well, for months I've been warning about the threat of vaccine passports and mandatory vaccinations. What seemed a distant dystopian nightmare has now arrived. On Thursday, we replaced democracy with tyranny in New South Wales. The freedoms that the Anzacs and the Diggers so bravely died for have been extinguished, namely the freedom of choice. This New South Wales government press release proudly announcing a freedom, but just for the fully vaccinated, is a document of shame and infamy, and the names of the 4 individuals on it have disgraced every ounce of decency and humanity in our once-free state and nation. A fan of this show and a respectable businessman, Patrick, wrote to me on Friday morning and he said, New South Wales government mandatory vaccines are tantamount to living in the Stasi-controlled former East Germany. Since when were Western-based governments, democratically elected to serve their constituents, now entitled to allow unelected health bureaucrats to control their constituents, enabled to violate doctor-to-patient privilege and coerce medicines and monitoring controls of their constituents? Enough, Patrick wrote. After this ongoing sinister totalitarian federal and state-based regime manipulating its constituents through didactic, draconian, dogmatic and dictatorial control, Patrick says he intends to leave this country, never to return and never again to utter the words, "I am an Australian." Moreover, he says he will not spend another cent on the economy of this country than necessary for a regime that has lost its legitimacy as a democracy and as a free market. That's Patrick. John Barilaro, one of the signatories to that document of shame, has disgustingly said that businesses which allow unvaccinated customers through their doors or hire staff who are not fully vaccinated will face significant fines. The sadism, the stupidity, and the cruelty of that decision is unfathomable. Not only have these boneheaded politicians and health bureaucrats willfully destroyed small businesses with their insane and frequently pointless lockdown restrictions and curfews, they are now turning businesses against their own customers, forcing the owners of small businesses to behave like Gestapo officers, checking people's papers, firing good and hard-to-find staff and scaring loyal customers away if they choose not to be vaccinated. It is beyond belief. And if these small businesses fail to comply, or more likely can't afford to comply, they'll get hammered with fines that drive them out of business anyway. Cruel, vindictive, and utterly indecent. Soon we will have an underclass of unemployed and socially isolated unvaccinated individuals, second-class citizens created by a so-called centre-right government. What a joke. But this madness is occurring around the world. Earlier in the week, we learned that in Nigeria, for instance, you can no longer worship in any churches or mosques without showing your vaccination passport. And you can't even access banking services.
Similarly, people will not be allowed to event centers for parties or receptions without showing proof of their vaccination cards at the gates of these occasions. We have made adequate arrangements with security to prevent anybody who does not have a vaccination card from accessing any of these events. Also, you will not be allowed to access banking services in Edo State from the middle of September if you have not been vaccinated.
So it looks like apartheid is back in vogue in Africa again. In Britain, also this week, Vaccines Minister Nadhim Zahawi said that although coronavirus passports, quote, go against the DNA of the Conservative Party, they are necessary to end the pandemic. And he has even said children should be allowed to overrule their parents and get vaccinated against their parents' wishes. Pol Pot, eat your heart out. Many Tories are furious, calling these plans unsupportable, coercive and discriminatory, which of course they are. Interestingly, back in January, Zahawi wrote on Twitter that the government has, quote, no plans to introduce vaccine passports because they're discriminatory. When asked, can we hold you to this, he replied, yes, you can. So much for principles. Goebbels would be impressed. In Canada, Justin Trudeau has launched an aggressive campaign vilifying those who are protesting against mandatory vaccinations, labelling them as anti-science. Oh, there's that phrase again. And anti-vaxxer mobs, which he claims are also racists and misogynists and so contemptible that he won't even call them protesters.
Yes, there is a small fringe element in this country that is angry, that doesn't believe in science, that is lashing out with racist, misogynistic attacks, and I know will not allow those voices, those special interest groups, those protesters who can, I don't even want to call them protesters, those anti-vaxxer mobs.
That's the way to go. Demonise them, dehumanise them. Lavrenti Beria would no doubt approve. In America, it's got so bizarre that one university has banned an unvaccinated student from attending classes, even though he was at home and those classes are online. The Attorney General of Arizona, meanwhile, declared last week that Tucson's vaccine mandate is illegal. And in Florida, Conservative Ron DeSantis has not only banned mandatory vaccinations, but he will fine businesses that discriminate against the unvaccinated, the complete opposite of John Barilaro and Gladys Berejiklian's approach. We've also seen 4 separate legal challenges here against mandatory vaccination on numerous grounds filed in the Supreme Court of New South Wales. On Friday, some 50,000 people viewed the live streaming of the opening of this session, which gives you an indication of the passion surrounding this issue. The hearings are later in the month. But already many businesses have taken matters into their own hands, with many Australian companies mandating vaccinations for their employees. The owners of Spotlight disgracefully say they will withhold Christmas bonuses from unvaccinated employees. How spiteful and nasty and petty can you get? I, for one, won't be going anywhere near their stores. And herein lies the rub. I have repeatedly said I have no problem whatsoever with people being vaccinated or not being vaccinated. What is not acceptable for multiple reasons, including constitutional and legal and ethical and moral reasons, is mandatory vaccination. Indeed, the Australian Immunisation Handbook spells it out very clearly that consent to being vaccinated must be given in the absence of undue pressure, coercion or manipulation. Barilaro, Perrottet, Berejiklian, Hazard, read it. Well, this week, an extremely experienced Qantas pilot, a man who hundreds of thousands of Australians have happily trusted with their lives, Captain Graham Hood, made a video about why he does not consent to taking the mandatory vaccination that Qantas have stipulated he must take. He is not an anti-vaxxer, by the way. He makes that crystal clear. But he's prepared to lose his job over this.
I have done 20,000 takeoffs and landings. I have spent 2,800 nights or so in hotel rooms. That amounts to almost 8 years in hotel rooms. I've done 175 simulators. I think I passed all of them. I've been thoroughly tested with over 50 medical examinations to hold my licence. And everything I stand for is now being threatened by a ridiculous mandate that I cannot support. It's a mandate that all aviation workers in the industry are now being forced to adopt, and that is no jab, no job.
There's lots in Captain Hood's video you may or may not agree with, and obviously he's not a medical expert, but my point is the ethical one. Once you start down this path of dividing any society into 2 distinct classes of people, you have abandoned liberty and democracy and replaced it with tyranny, fear and suspicion. Worse, and this is what really disturbs me, once the authorities have decreed that there are now 2 classes of Australian, the good and the bad, and that one class is superior to another and gets special privileges, while the other class is shunned, locked out, vilified and loses their employment, you have by definition created an inferior class, for which the Germans once coined a simple word which roughly translates as under or inferior person. Untermensch. If that word brings a chill of horror to your heart, so it should. You see, we have already seen during this pandemic two extremely disturbing trends. One is how zealously and vindictively the police and other authorities implement these restrictions, regardless of how petty or absurd those restrictions may be. Think of Zoe Buller arrested in her pyjamas in front of her kids for a Facebook post. Think of those individuals tackled to the ground or dragged out of their cars for not wearing a mask or being outside the 5K zone or whatever else. People denied seeing their dying relatives, drones patrolling the parks, mounted police on our beaches. Just wait till they turn on the unvaccinated. Secondly, think of how our state premiers have actively encouraged citizens to spy on each other and to turn each other in, demonising and dehumanising supposed offenders. This is beyond reprehensible, poisoning community goodwill, breeding fear and suspicion between neighbours, associates, even families. It's sickening. Another email I received is from a registered nurse who says she is not an anti-vaxxer, but she simply cannot take the vaccine for various reasons. In her desperation, she has written expressly to Greg Hunt, and this is her letter to Greg Hunt, and I quote her letter. What type of democracy does this to their own people? She says, I live in an isolated rural area where there have been no cases of this virus for over 12 months. I have paid taxes and worked my entire life. I am now treated like a monster, she says. If the vaccine is effective, she asks, why are people so scared of me? There you go. I've received many, many such letters and emails. Let me repeat, I'm not arguing this from a public health perspective, but rather from an ethical and moral perspective. Inevitably, some small businesses or local communities will seek ways to defy these draconian laws, thereby entrenching an underclass, two societies, an underground economy of the unvaccinated. Indeed, the man who originated this show, now the leader of One Nation in the New South Wales Parliament, issued a video this week advising people how to protect their personal health information and ensure it cannot be accessed by government agencies.
Well, people do have rights, and there are ways of resisting this, and what I'm recommending to everyone is please do what I've done today. Go to the Australian Immunisation Register, get this form. It's called Ceasing Correspondence and Release of Information. Fill it out, it'll only take you about a minute. It's only two short pages there. And if you fill it out and lodge it with the federal government, you've got the right, the legal right under the laws of the Commonwealth not to have any third party access your vaccination status, not even your doctor. So what I'm planning to do, if there's a police officer asking me for papers at a cafe, is to say, well, no, I have a legal right under the Commonwealth law, which overrides New South Wales law, not to have to show anyone my vaccination status.
Mark Latham. The Morrison government has spinelessly avoided doing what it should do, in my opinion, if it had a shred of decency, and declare mandatory vaccination un-Australian, unconstitutional and illegal, as Ron DeSantis, a true conservative, wish we had one of those, has done in Florida. And this week in Denmark, all COVID restrictions and vaccine passports were scrapped. Yet here, our Liberals and Nationals are supporting these undemocratic, dangerously divisive and quite frankly sadistic measures. And that is what truly fills me with horror. Why? Because the premiers and their chief health officers have already abused their powers, made catastrophic errors, such as the hotel quarantine fiasco in Melbourne that unnecessarily cost over 800 Australian lives and made Australia a byword for COVID tyranny and oppression and a laughingstock around the world. But the worst, I fear, is yet to come. In a chilling article that could have come straight out of some dystopian film script, the left-wing Washington Post argued that doctors must be allowed to turn away the unvaccinated. Think about it. At the same time, the left-wing TV show host Jimmy Kimmel ranted that the unvaccinated should not get access to intensive care units. And he went so far as to sneer at the unvaccinated who got sick. He said, Rest in peace, Wheezy. That was the punchline to his vile tirade. This is evil. One of the most sacred oaths is the Hippocratic Oath. Every doctor knows only too well, the earliest expression of medical ethics in the Western world, dating back to ancient Greece. It is at the very cornerstone of all our medical sciences and includes such noble and inspirational ethics as never deliberately cause any harm to a patient, first do no harm, as well as upholding the sanctity of patient-doctor confidentiality. Are we really prepared to countenance the day when a pregnant woman in her pyjamas is denied the trip to hospital because she is unvaccinated? Are we really prepared for the pedestrian left bleeding on the roadside because he is unvaccinated? Are we really happy that people who have paid taxes all their lives now be shunned and locked out because they have decided not to be vaccinated? Is this the world we are building, Australia? A world that the ancient Greeks would regard as barbaric and inhumane. I mean, surely no one in their right mind would countenance denying sick or injured people access to medical services because they don't have a vaccine passport. Would they?
To protect the health system, we've got everybody locked down. We're going to move to a situation where, to protect the health system, we're going to lock out people who are not vaccinated and can be. If you're making the choice not to get vaccinated, then you're making the wrong choice. You're making the wrong choice. And for safety's sake, and back to that point about how much work our nurses have to do, as this becomes absolutely a pandemic of the unvaccinated and we open everything up, it's not going to be safe for people who are not vaccinated to be roaming around the place spreading the virus.
Australia, what in God's name are we doing?